Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Patreon Q&A. It's good to be back, and I'm looking forward to reading through some of the questions, so let's jump right in. First up, Connery Kateni asked, is there another good place to get SCART cables other than Retro Access and Retro Gaming cables? As far as large volume goes, not that I know of. I've seen a bunch of people on eBay actually make very high quality cables, but in extremely low volume, just a few at a time, because, to be honest, making cables is a gigantic pain, and it's just really hard to do it right. So while you might stumble across a couple of people making good ones here and there, and you might even be able to stumble across some of the original factory-built cables, generally speaking, those are the two manufacturers that I would recommend, and I've had really great luck with them over the years, and both have been very responsive to improvements and feedback, especially in the past year or two. So it's great to feel like we have two manufacturers on our side and willing to work with us, and that's one of the many reasons why I always promote those two. That and consistent amounts of production, not just 5 cables here and there, and it's a lot of the work that's gone into both of them. So yeah, those are definitely the two that I would recommend sticking with in most scenarios. Connery also asked if there's any way to make the 2-chip SNESs look like a 1-chip, and at this time there's nothing, and it really doesn't look like there's going to be any mods in the future. There are specific things you could do to certain revision 2 chips. I believe it's the APU revision that has this terrible checkerboard pattern over the RGB signal, and if you lift the composite video pin, that completely clears it up. But overall, if you're looking to use original hardware and you just want the sharpest image possible, either get a 1-chip or a modded mini. That being said, though, Firebrand X chimed in and was totally correct. The Super NT is technically a perfectly sharp 2-chip because that's what Kevtris based his FPGA cores off of, the original 2-chip SNES. So you get the 100% compatibility and none of the few glitches of the 1-chips on there. And I really do love that console and think it's one of the only, I hate to call it a clone console, but one of the only clone consoles I've ever seen that I sometimes would use over the original. And when the RGB adapter comes out for it, if it ever does, who knows? Maybe that might be overall the best solution for it. The only other thing, though, depending how big of a SNES fan you are, it might be worth it just to buy a couple. So the SNES is by far my favorite console. So I have a 1-chip that's been modded. I have a mini that's been modded with just the sRGB pass-through, and then I also have a Japanese Super Famicom that's a 2-chip. It's one of the original revisions. So, and of course the Super NT. I know that's a little overkill and a bit crazy to have all of those, but it's my favorite console, so I want to cover all ground. But for your average person, I would either get the Super NT or, to be honest, it's easier to hunt down a mini and do a very easy mod to it. So those would be my first 2 choices. And they should be sort of similarly priced. So you're going to have to, it's about $230 for the Super NT, and for the SNES Mini with an RGB mod, if you want to pay somebody else to do it for you, after shipping and all that, it might actually come close to that. So it's about the same price, but at least both are great options. Firebrand X chimed in with a question. He wants to know if winners of your Patreon prizes can also get an autographed self-portrait photo of you. He's totally jealous of Steve's framed photo of you in his bedroom. So, I can't imagine why anybody would want a picture of my ugly mug, but for the record, that picture in Steve's background is actually a digital photo frame, and Steve himself took the screenshot of me and stuck it in there just to be silly. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of strange to me, because I still just the nerdy fat guy that loves Super Nintendo and heavy metal. But at the same time, I see Chris Larson's point. He said he's got autographed pictures of Jax, Scorpion, the guy that made Qbert, Ken Williams from Sierra. That's awesome. And, I do have a picture of Johnny Cage signed in Scorpion as well, because I believe he did those characters. And I think that's freaking awesome. It is just very cool to see a signed picture of the guy who I'm used to, like, doing the split and punching me in the balls. So, yeah, if anybody wants that, of course, I'd be glad to. It is just kind of funny to me. But, yeah, anything you Patreons want, I just want to try to give back, because, not to get all cheesy again, but it's your support that allows this stuff to happen. So, anything you guys want, let me know. Joseph Turman said he also grew up with a TRS-80 and would be interested in any of the mods I'm doing to mine. I still haven't even powered it up, but when I do, I want to do exactly what you were looking to do. I'm going to do RF into a VCR, out to composite, into the RetroTink 2X. The VCR should actually be arriving today, so I'll get to that right away. But once I make sure everything works, and it came with one game, and I believe they power on to just a DOS prompt, or a basic, MS Basic prompt without any cartridge in there. Once I verify everything works, I'm going to start digging into it. But I believe there are things like flash carts, the tape drive emulators, I think. There's the Color Computer 3 as well, so I'm not trying to figure out which parts or which enhancements go to each. But in a perfect world, I would get an RGB output for this thing so I could use it right into my PVM. But I'll definitely keep everybody updated, and hopefully we'll make a pretty cool video on it. Alejandro Maldonado was asking, can he use some kind of component to SDI converter so that he doesn't have to replace the HD SDI input of his 20L5 with a component video one? So there's two things I have to say to that. First, I could be wrong, but I thought all 20L5s have component video inputs on the bottom. So if you're looking at the back of it, the card is to the left. It's one of those shorty cards. And on the bottom, there's all of the inputs right there, including composite and S-Video. If yours doesn't have that, please post a picture. I'd love to see what yours looks like. But that would be my solution. But to answer your direct question, you can't really get an HD SDI or SDI to component converter that will work for retro gaming. The issue is that SDI is only a 480i format, so you can't put 240p in it, and HD SDI is only 720p and 1080i. So if you were specifically going to use a 720p signal, yeah, that would actually work fine, but it doesn't work with 480p. So the two major resolutions we would want to use in retro gaming, 240p and 480p, aren't going to work. So unless you bought that monitor specifically to work with PS2 or I guess GameCube, really any console that could be predominantly 480i, then I wouldn't try that at all. If by some coincidence your favorite console is PS2 and that's all you really care about, PS2 in 480i mode, yeah, you could actually just get a component video to SDI. You wouldn't need HD SDI, just SDI converter, and it would work fine. But it doesn't seem like that's what you're going for, so unfortunately you would really just have to sell that card and buy the component video one. Sorry. Moon Turtle asked, what is the minimum number of lines an SD CRT can have, and is there any use case where fewer lines might be advantageous for quality of picture? I think for your average consumer TV, late 80s and up, it's probably 200 to 250 lines. When you get older, there could be less, but for your average gaming TVs, that's probably it. And I think the highest ever made was 1,000 lines, and I believe that was on some of the BVMs like my D32 and one of the E-Series 20-inch. So it's really a matter of opinion, because I've heard people complain that BVMs are way too sharp and the scan lines are too dark and they hate the look of it. I personally think the more lines the better. I think I always like the sharpest image possible, but I still prefer a CRT for these classic games because just the overall look, the scan lines almost give it, like the space between almost gives it a depth feel. It's weird to describe unless you've been in front of one. But it really is just a matter of preference. I know some people prefer the lower line look of an arcade monitor. But one thing that you might want to take a look at that I thought was pretty cool was I snapped a picture of a higher-end consumer-grade TV, and I took pictures of the Super Mario World title screen. This is a project I never finished last year that I hope to jump back into. But you could actually see here, you could actually count the different lines on the top of the R. So that kind of is a good way to show the count in this. And then also I took a screenshot of a 600 line Sony PVM, so once again you could count the little dots and see that there's more in there. And then finally I took a screenshot of the D32, the 1000 line monitor, where you could see a lot more. So I think these three pictures, while it's really hard to, hopefully if you're able to watch this video in 1080p, otherwise if it gets squished it might not look right. But I think these three pictures are pretty good representations of what to expect. And once again, it's the space between on the CRTs that really, in my opinion, makes the feel different. That's why even if you're only able to get a lower line count CRT, for older games I would still prefer it. And it's just, in my opinion, it's pretty cool just to see the difference. Let me just zoom in on the last one again. So, 400 lines, I think, or 450. We'd have to count the top row to double check. 600, once again, I think. I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this is the right model. And then the 1,000 line. So it's pretty impressive. I love stuff like this, and hopefully that was a decent enough answer to your question. But at the end of the day, if you have a choice between a few monitors, I would take a look and see which one your eyes prefer. Two quick ones from my buddy Chris from Belgium. First, he went on to explain how the Ultimate 64, the Commodore 64 kit works. Anybody that's interested in that, definitely check out the comments. But basically, they draw each line twice to get 576p, so basically the 480p, but more lines for the PAL TVs. And each line is drawn twice. The second line that it outputs is either a dimmer version of the previous line or a full brightness line. And the dim line gives an awesome CRT effect. And while the exact copy of the previous line gives a crisp, solid image. So that's pretty cool. Also, if you do the solid line version, you'd be able to still use a line halfer to get whatever the 240p resolution would be. I got something here that I'll be testing soon that supposedly works well and is pretty cheap. I won't be able to test it on a Commodore 64, but I'll try to test it on PAL 576p signals. And also, Chris mentioned something that I didn't even think of, and I definitely should have. He said that now that I've released the Q&As to the public, his full name was visible, so he changed it to his nickname. Maybe you should warn your patrons about that. I didn't even think of that. So if anybody has any thoughts on that at all, please let me know. I have no problem taking the Q&As down publicly or anything like that and just leaving them Patreon only. I didn't even consider that privacy factor. I just assumed because everything's online now, that's just the way it is. But thank you for bringing that up, and I certainly didn't mean to accidentally put anybody's name out there without their permission. Eric Hurley asked, what cables would I recommend he buy to daisy chain two PVMs together? He wants to connect the outputs of one to the inputs of another. I use these that I got from monoprice.com. They're fairly cheap, but they're pretty good quality, and they're just BNC to BNC cables. I'm not sure if you can get Monoprice to ship to Ireland. I think you still live in Ireland. So I would just kind of look at Amazon for ones that look the same and give them a try. If you want to get really crazy and you want to guarantee that you're using the most shielded cables, you get RCA to BNC adapters, but you get really good quality ones. Those ones that you see on eBay, 10 for 99 cents, are crap, and sometimes they don't even make the connection fully. If you wiggle the wire, you could see the signal. But you go and get the really good ones, and then you get HD Retrovision has just RCA to RCA cables. Now these are only 3 colors because they're really meant as component, but you could use those for RGB and then just get whatever, just one shielded RCA cable for sync. The shielding and the quality of the cable isn't as important, especially since it's going to be separated from the rest. Just a decent one would work. And that's kind of an overly anal, crazy way to guarantee shielded cables between them. But I think you'd probably be in luck just trying to find basic BNC cables and some European distributor, as long as they look thick and shielded, and hopefully they even list in the description if they're shielded or not. I'd start with those and just kind of see how it works for you. Also, keep in mind, I've seen some PVMs not work with the daisy chaining, and I believe the issue is, the parts inside get old, and maybe a wire came loose, maybe one of the terminations on the board's bad, maybe it needs a recap, whatever. There's a million things. But if you said you wanted to go from your 14-inch to your 20. If for whatever reason that doesn't work, try reversing it and go from the 20 to the 14. Question from M Monkey. What's up, Pete? I didn't even know you were a Patreon subscriber. Thank you so much. Your site is awesome, too, and I learned a lot, especially when I was first starting out my website. I was just trying to sift through all the crap on the internet, and your website pointed me in the right direction a lot, so thank you again. But he asked if I know anyone who's tried the Neo Geo HDMI mod. and I don't, but I believe the person who did that is, I think, is also one of the ones working on the Dreamcast mod. And as you posted, Dan, Citrus 3000 PSI, was looking into that as well. And I know that Dan had also just gotten one of those cheap MVSs from China, the ones that already come consoleized. So depending on how the output of that looks, maybe he'll put it in there. But it's a promising project, and it's something that I think would be pretty cool for Neo Geo owners, especially people who do any of the online streaming. So at the moment, right now, if you want to get the best quality from your arcades out to the internet, you need to go and mod it with a splitter, a proper splitter, a powered one, not just a Y cable. Then you need to measure the outputs and attenuate that to 75 ohm on one side and stick it through an open source scan converter into a capture card. So that's a very complicated and expensive solution, whereas if you just had the HDMI mod, you'd be able to run your stand-up cab perfectly and just plug an HDMI cable into your capture card to stream the entire setup over the internet in crystal clear, pixel perfect quality. So hopefully we'll see somebody doing mods on that soon. And I certainly know people like iFix Arcade and Brooklyn Video Games, especially BVG, who runs a lot of those arcade tournaments. The King of Fighters tournaments, I believe, is what they run all the time down there. I think that would make their setup a lot easier. So if anybody here knows that, please as well chime in down below. Maybe somebody's already got working prototypes on YouTube, but the only stuff I've seen was a few years old and it didn't seem complete yet. But let's keep our fingers crossed. Tofu Man asked if I had tried both Tim and Bordy's N64 RGB solutions and how they stack up to each other. Well, if you're running Bordy's firmware on both, I think they're pretty much the same. Maybe Bordy's newer revision boards adds a few extra things like component out and I think 480p. But if you're just talking about RGB output, I'm pretty sure it's the same on both, and the deblur looks awesome. Some people prefer the smudged look of an N64. I don't. I thought it looked way better with the deblur running in most games. And he also asked, is it as effective as on the Ultra HDMI? Technically it is, but I think when you're using it on a flat screen, the effect is more dramatic because just the basic lines cutting through the image on a CRT will help mask some of that stuff. So while I think it's identical, it's probably going to be more dramatic if you used it like through the open source scan converter. But I think the bottom line is you just need to decide what you're going to be gaming the most on. So if you really think that you're predominantly gaming on flat screens, definitely get the Ultra HDMI because it's a digital to digital mod. It never goes to analog, so it's going to be as sharp and perfect as possible. Whereas any analog signal at all, even the best you could possibly get, and even if you theoretically soldered everything together so there wasn't even long lines, when you go from analog to digital, there's something. Sometimes you could only see it if you zoom in 100 times. Sometimes 5x through the open source scan converter is enough to see it. But it's really just a matter of deciding which solution you prefer. And if you insist on both, either get two N64s, or I believe Dan, Citrus 3000 PSI, is the only person to actually install Tim's board and the Ultra HDMI in the same N64. And if that's the case, you have that option as well because it'll run simultaneous. So maybe for streamers, that's the perfect option because you could do 1080p through the Ultra HDMI and 240p deblur RGB through the RGB port. But either way, at least there's tons of options for N64 and a lot of good stuff to choose from. Clint Collage asked if I had seen or used the Garo RGB bypass that Adam Zay worked on. I actually haven't, and to be honest, my Garo worked perfect for me. So I'm not really sure if it's that I wasn't seeing the same things, or maybe it was the same shortcomings as my key digital adapter, so I was just used to it and thought that's just the way it was. In the case of the Garo, not in the case of all retro gaming equipment, but if you try it and your solution works for you, I would just leave well enough alone. You'd mentioned that other people had better luck using the SCART lights sync regeneration rather than do the mod. So if it's working for you, leave well enough alone, but I think a better path to take is modding the console itself. So in the case of something like the PS2 or the Wii, doing that PS2 C-Sync mod, so you always get C-Sync directly out, including in 480p mode without any sync stripper needed or anything, that's definitely the better way to go. And for the Wii, I think Dan's going to have the Wii Dual available pretty soon. That would be by far the best way, because you can get all resolutions right through the RGBS port and run it right through all of your G-SCART switches. So I'm not sure what other consoles are component only. I think it might be the Xbox, and there are some VGA mods for that, I believe. I'd have to look more into that, but I think maybe it would just be the Xbox, the original Xbox at this point. So if possible, definitely look into the console side mods, and it just saves a lot of trouble. If the Garo is working fine otherwise, I'd leave well enough alone, and I would only try that mod if you were having specific issues that mod said it would help. So sorry, I hope hope that was a decent enough answer. Dan S. wants to try the AV Famicom RGB mod, but he's not very experienced with soldering and wants to know if anybody in the Ohio, Pennsylvania, or West Virginia area that would be able to do these mods with him there so he could learn how to do it. I don't. Maybe somebody down in the comments below could post, or maybe you could. I don't know if you could direct message on Patreon. I would hope that that's a feature that people could do. But if somebody knows, please contact me and I'll contact Dan. But the one thing that you should really keep in mind is that the biggest hurdle in a lot of these mods is the tools, not so much the skills. So while yes, you should definitely practice on something before doing an AV Famicom, anything. Buy a cheap piece of electronics from a junk store for $1 and then just sit there and practice stuff on that. The bigger hurdle is going to be the correct equipment, because if you sit there with one of those Radio Shack pump solder things to do the desoldering, you'll be there all day, and you could rip a trace out depending on how it goes. So the one thing to keep in mind is that a really good Heiko desoldering gun is like $250, $300, and even the Chinese knockoffs that are good enough to do it are still going to cost more than it would cost to have one of the top-end people do this mod for you. So if you're really just interested in modding as a hobby, pick up a piece of crap or a couple of piece of crap devices from a junk store, order one of those Chinese knockoff desoldering guns and a knockoff Heiko kit. So the Heiko soldering guns are also hundreds of dollars, but you can get the knockoffs for about $100, and just sit down with those, get some flux, desolder braid, and really just practice on junk electronics, and that should be fine. But if you don't own all that stuff and you only want to do 1 or 2 mods, it's way cheaper just to send it out and have somebody else do it for you. So I would just really decide what your end goal is with all of this and go from there. And lastly, Daniel Caldron said he read that 4K LG OLEDs are amazing with the OSSC. Is there a 4K TV you recommend that handles 5X? So generally speaking, for the past year or so, the TCL TVs, even the cheap ones, as long as you get the TCL app and then you go into the settings and you turn all the crap off, you actually need the iPhone or the cell phone app to do this too. Not all of the settings are available through the remote menu. It's very weird, but once you get in there and you turn everything off and you turn on game mode, supposedly they're all about a frame or less of lag. And I think the 2018s are about the same as well. And supposedly they also work with all 5 modes of the OSSC. I actually just brought my Super Nintendo out of storage, and hopefully this weekend I'll be able to go and test out a couple of different TVs, 2 different TCLs, a 2017 and a 2018, and that way I'd be able to test with all modes and also be able to test lag on all of them. The 5X mode is a little tricky, though, because I have a 2017 or 2016, I believe, OLED TV, and it's just under 2 frames of lag, so not perfect, but not enough for me to hate the lag on it, and it looks ridiculously amazing. I'm still blown away. I'm so lucky that I found that on, in the clearance part of a Magnolia Theater, but the one strange thing about it is if I boot my OSSC in 5X mode, it does not work. But if I boot it in any other mode, load up the game, start playing the game, and switch to 5X mode, it usually works. So I don't understand what the deal with that is. I've tried different firmwares on the TV, but if you have the money, it's something that, it's a pretty big jump in quality, especially for movies and TV. But that's a pretty huge jump in price. If you only care about gaming, and you know, watching TV is fine. Most TV doesn't look great through broadcast or apps anyway, but the TCL TVs seem to be fine. Hopefully I'll have a video up soon that shows just the basic lag on each of them. Well, just not each of them. There's a bunch of submodels. I just mean one random 2017 and one random 2018, and they seem to be compatible with all the modes. So I believe my cousin just got a 50-inch for under $400. I mean, you can't really beat that price. So maybe if you're looking to save some money and get one that's probably 99% going to work with all 5 modes, the TCLs are best. I didn't actually ask where you lived, though, because if you're outside of North America, I don't think TCLs are sold anywhere else. I do believe that LGs have pretty good compatibility as well, and you might want to message Ace somewhere. I did the interview with him last year, and he loves LG TVs, and he's just as obsessed as we all are with low lag and good quality. So if you're outside of North America, you might want to message him somewhere and see. But if you're in North America, and just the TCL is probably a good one to pick up. Alright, that's it for this week. Another bunch of awesome questions, so thank you so much for everybody for participating. The more the merrier. I really enjoy doing these, and I hope they're at least a little bit of a help. But, you know, as always, thank you guys so much for being Patreons. It really means a lot, and it's so cool that I get to have this channel and do the work that I've been doing. So hopefully there's a lot more to come, and I'll see you next time.